In this day and age, we largely think of punishment from the law being as something as you are incarcerated for. You spend time in jail, learning the error of your ways, hopefully, and rejoin society as a better person, more willing to obey the law. But how do you incarcerate somebody who can teleport? How do you keep somebody in prison if they require a diet of blood to function? What if you don't want to imprison your MC because you don't want to spend the next 3 years writing about the guy in jail? What if you're running a role playing game and you want to punish the players because the law caught them, but you don't really want to shove them in a jail cell? There are other options for punishment. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Punishment under the law, what has been done historically, and how you can apply that to a fantasy world. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If these kinds of topics interest you, hit the subscribe button down below. And if you want to discuss these topics with other like-minded individuals, there is a link to my Discord server down below as well. Okay, let's get cracking. Before you decide what kind of punishments should be used by your legal system, you need to decide what the focus of your legal system is. As I see it, there are three focus areas for your legal system's punishment specifically. They can either be focused on prevention, so the idea is to stop people doing these crimes, both through addressing the individual doing the crime, so preventing the person from doing the crime again, and by setting an example of deterring others who might be considering this crime so that they look at the punishment and they're like, oh no, I don't want that to happen to me, so I'm not going to commit this crime. Or your legal system can be revenge focused. So it can be focused on avenging the victim of the crime. So you can take this to extremes, and in fact, the very early Greek judicial system did take this to extremes. They allowed the victim of a crime or the family of the victim of a crime to commit a commensurate crime against the perpetuators of the crime in order to take vengeance for the wrong done to them. The problem with that kind of system is that that very eye for an eye system led to massive feuds in the Greek legal system. And of course, those feuds were self-perpetuating because you've done a crime against me, but I say I didn't do it and you weren't justified in doing this crime. So now I do the same crime against you. And this eye for an eye leads to a very eyeless world very fast. And that is why the Greek system reformed. Now, their first attempt at reform gave us the word Draconian because Draco was the guy who did the reforms, and he was pretty much of the Queen of Hearts persuasion. Every single crime was off with his head. There was a lot of capital punishment. It was eventually Solon, of whom I've spoken before, that ended up revising some of those laws and introducing different punishments under the Greek legal system. But I digress. I'm talking about the focus of the legal system. So you can have your legal system be revenge focused, where either the state or the individuals who are wronged take revenge on the criminal for their actions against the victim. Or your legal system's punishment can be focused on rehabilitation, the return of the criminal to the society in a state where the criminal doesn't want to or won't commit the crime again. Often this takes the form of some kind of training or some kind of psychological rework. So those are your primary focuses, as I see it, of the punishments of your legal systems. And of course, you can mix and match these. So your system could be prevention and rehabilitation focused, or it could be revenge and prevention focused, or a combination of all three. But there's probably one part that it focuses on more than others. If you enjoyed this discussion of the focus of your legal system's punishment, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about the types of punishment that you can have under the law. So, the first type of punishment that I want to talk about is psychological punishment. This often ties into the focus of being rehabilitation focused. And it's punishments like the religious punishment of excommunication. The person is excommunicated from the church until they alter their behavior and can once again join the community of the faithful. So you can see that that is very much a rehabilitation focused activity. Excommunication is, of course, a very religious punishment with a lot of religious overtones, but you can achieve the same kind of punishment in a secular society by looking into things like ostracism. So this is where the people of the society don't see the criminal, they don't interact with the criminal. The criminal is ostracized from the society. They could, of course, be physically exiled as well, but I want to focus here on that kind of, they're still there, but nobody talks to them, as a psychological punishment. And Jane M. All used this as the way that her Neanderthal people punished one of their own. If the person was found guilty of a crime, they were declared dead to the tribe, either for a few days or sometimes permanently. And the rest of the tribe refused to see that person for the duration of their death. They didn't interact with them, they didn't feed them, they were in no way part of the tribe. You can also implement this in a lesser form where maybe somebody is just not allowed to, interact with the politics, so they're not allowed to vote, or they're not allowed to appear before the king, or some kind of psychological removal of privileges until they amend their behavior and start acting as society wishes them to act again. The other psychological punishment is more of a thing you see in sci-fi, and it is actually, in my opinion, a very grim, dark kind of punishment, and that is brain alteration. Of course, this is normally rehabilitation focused because you will quite often put the shell of the person that you have thus altered back into society to function in society as a drone or as a worker of some sort. But I would argue that it's one hell of a prevention method as well. So this was mentioned in passing in Anne McCaffrey's Crystal Singer series, where they speak about criminals having their brains spun out, criminals going into rehabilitation cells and having their brains spun out and then being put back to work in society in menial jobs like street sweepers and the like. So you could build that kind of a punishment as well, which is, I would say that is a pretty brutal punishment. I guess you could make a lot of arguments about how it is still philosophically better than killing somebody. Personally, I would rather hang than have all of my memories removed and be made into a zombie. But that's a personal thing. Maybe your society feels differently, and maybe that's an argument you want to make in your story. Okay, so that's psychological punishments. But they weren't the most common punishments, right? The most common punishment is physical punishment. Incarceration is, of course, a physical punishment. But there are some things that you should consider if you're going to use incarceration. The first question is, who actually pays for the maintenance of the person in prison? Is it the state who pays for the person? Because that isn't actually that common. It is often the case in the past where the incarcerated could very well die in prison from hunger because the state wouldn't necessarily feed them. Their family or somebody on the outside had to pay for their food. Otherwise, they just didn't get fed. Or they had to be part of a work gang. Otherwise, they just didn't get fed. So it's worth thinking about who pays for the incarcerated person to stay alive. If you're incarcerating people, you should also ask yourself whether the goal is punishment or rehabilitation or removal from society. Because depending on your answer to that, depends on what kind of a prison we're talking about. Up here in the Nordics, for example, we have, I guess, what you would call very progressive prisons. And, people can, with lesser crimes, can go home for the weekend and return on Monday to prison. In Finland, we're experimenting with villages as prisons that don't actually have fences and whatnot, that people stay in houses. But that's because our judicial punishments are focused on rehabilitation and not on punishment. If your judicial system's punishments are focused on prevention and on revenge, your prisons are likely to be more like the medieval prisons of Europe, which were gruesome and many, many people died in them. So it's worth thinking about that focus area again and what that makes of your prisons. But prisons takes us back to people spending a lot of time in a simple jail cell, and that's often detrimental to your story. So let's talk about the other form of punishment, which is pain. Pain is often prevention-based, and it is sometimes revenge-based. It is very explicitly revenge-based if you allow the victim to be the inflictor of pain. It's almost never rehab-based, so you're not looking to rehabilitate the person, you're looking to prevent anybody else from doing it, and I guess to prevent the person as well, but you're not actually doing anything to rehabilitate their behavior. Inflicting pain on people as a means of punishment was often done by whips, by putting people in stocks and making them carry stocks around, by attaching heavy weights to people, by putting weights on somebody who is lying on the floor, by various gruesome medieval torture implements. Anything that inflicts pain but stops short of killing the person could be used. Obviously, the most common of this was the flogging mechanic, where you would flog a person on their back by means of a whip, and that could vary in degree. So you had single-tailed whips, you had multi-tailed whips, you had whips that had barbs kind of plaited into them, whips that were coated in lead, and all of these inflicted, of course, varying degrees of pain. So you can kind of scale your pain up and down depending on who the person is and what they did and how old they are. Like a child could maybe be, whipped with a switch, whereas a adult could be whipped with a 9-tailed flogger that has barbed wire plaited into it. And so you can kind of offer a scale in your pain as punishment. Again, this is going to result in a fairly grim society, but then all of these harsher punishments are. And then, of course, on the physical side, we come to the big one, the death penalty, capital punishment. Capital punishment is always focused on prevention and revenge. It is never focused on rehabilitation. The dude is dead. There's no rehabilitation involved here. So how was capital punishment administered? So if you want to be more kind, or if the person is of high enough status, you might offer suicide as a capital punishment. Jacqueline Carey did this in her series when capital punishment was involved. The person who was sentenced to death could choose the means of their death, either a swift-acting poison or falling on their sword, or however they wanted to approach it. You can also see this in the samurai culture with seppuku. Now, seppuku started as a means of protest, but by the 1400s, it was offered to samurai who were found guilty of crimes as a means to expiate their shame and end their life. So you could go with a suicide mechanic. Of course, Rome famously went with the absolute worst ways to die, in my opinion. Nero lit people alight and executed them at the stake. There was crucifixion, and of course, if the Romans really wanted you to suffer, they crucified you upside down. They put people in a sack with weasels and threw the sack into the river, and the weasels ate their way out. So the Romans were really pretty gruesome about this. But the Romans brings me to the topic of status and punishment. So all of these punishments that I was talking about Rome, yeah, Roman citizens couldn't be crucified. Roman citizens could only be executed for treason and patricide. And because there was a prohibition in Rome of spilling blood in the city limits, you were normally strangled, not crucified, not wrapped in a sack, not any of those things. If you were a Roman citizen, you were treated quite differently under the law from a non-Roman citizen. So it is worth thinking about the effect that status has on the punishment pronounced on a person. Would a noble die differently from how a commoner would die if they're both sentenced to capital punishment? Now, I said that Rome had gruesome punishments, but it wasn't just Rome. We all remember that scene in Game of Thrones where Joffrey gets the crown that he deserves and Khal Drogo has molten gold poured over his head. In Ecuador, in the 1500s, a Spanish governor was executed in this fashion. So that's a bare 500 years ago. A guy was executed by having molten gold poured down his throat. It is a singularly terrible way to die. We have, in our past as humans, definitely employed capital punishment in the most gruesome ways. So if you're building that kind of a grim, dark, crapsack world, go take a look at how we've killed people and work that into your punishment system, and I promise you, your world will feel grim and dark as our history. If you enjoyed that discussion of physical punishments, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up. And let's talk a little bit about economic punishments. So economic punishments are often more rehabilitative focused and they are more preventative focused, though they can sometimes have an element of victim compensation as well. Economic punishments are often through the application of fines, good old fines. The problem with fines are they do lend themselves to favoring the rich. So basically, the rich can pay off any crime that they have. And this is explicit then under your law system. Because if somebody can afford to pay the cost of raping a woman, then they can rape a woman and just pay the cost and be done. If somebody can pay the blood price of a human, they can kill that person and just pay the blood price. So you need to be aware that there are these pitfalls with economic punishments, that you can step into the bear trap of the rich basically being completely immune to any consequences of their actions. And you can see this in our world if you look at the practice of buying indulgences from the Roman Catholic Church and the level of corruption that that led to, not just among the rich, but also amongst the priests. They would sell indulgences to people to not be guilty of committing the sin they were committing even before committing the sin. So it's definitely worth thinking very slowly and carefully about how you implement economic punishments. Also under economic punishments for me forms slavery, because what would often happen in this kind of a system is if you cannot afford the economic punishment, if you cannot afford the fine, then you have to work to pay off that fine. And that work was normally done by your rights being taken away and you being forced to work, which is slavery. It is criminal slavery rather than chattel slavery, but it is slavery. What happens to people who can't afford to pay the fine? Do they end up in a situation where they are in a forced labor situation? Okay, so we've spoken about economic punishments and physical punishments and psychological punishments, but this is fantasy, so let's talk a little bit about the fantastical elements. Now, I spoke earlier about the difficulty of imprisoning mages or fantastical creatures like vampires. If somebody needs blood every day to survive and you put them in a prison cell, you're essentially killing them, or you're killing everybody who's in there with them. It's worth thinking about what kind of punishments become mandated by the abilities of your fantastical creatures and your wizards. You know, if your wizard can teleport at will, he's not going to stay in a prison. So how do you punish wizards? Also, could you punish people by removing their magic? Trudy Canavan does this in her Black Magician series, where mages that are found guilty of crimes are stripped of their magic, their magical powers are bound. That then involves a loss of the magical skill, which could be a psychological punishment of epic proportions if you're used to being a mage, especially if magic is a life-giving thing where it makes your life richer by having magic, and now it's removed from you. It would almost be like blinding somebody or chopping off their hand. It would be like a physical mutilation. Speaking of which, obviously under physical punishments, you can have physical mutilation as a punishment. So you could chop somebody's hands off or blind them as a physical punishment. And this, for me, would fall under that physical causing pain punishment, though of course it does have permanent effects as well. There is also the potential in fantasy for more brutal punishments, because you could have a situation where fantastical creatures are more capable of taking physical punishment. So things could be done to them that would be less bad than if it were done to a normal human. So as I was saying, with a physical mutilation, maybe, you know, you chop off somebody's hand, but they take 2 or 3 years to regrow their hand, because that is how this fantastical race works. So in that case, chopping off somebody's hand wouldn't be a permanent mutilation. It would more be a temporary thing that would require them to overcome this disability with time. So it's worth thinking about how the physical attributes of your fantastical race and your magic alters the punishments applied to people, especially in the realms of physical and psychological punishments. Obviously, the death penalty is the death penalty, and economic punishments are pretty much economic punishments. And those are my thoughts on punishments in fantasy worlds. If you'd like to support me in making more of these videos, links to my Ko-fi page and my books down below. And if you enjoyed this video, you'll probably enjoy my video on legal frameworks. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World.